From the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, this is Folklore. I'm your host, James Hernisham. I have to admit that I was a little disappointed when Caleb Rudow's staff asked that our interview be conducted in Asheville instead of somewhere a bit closer to folklore country. After all, Rudow is running to represent our county, well, part of it anyway, in the U.S. Congress, and I was hoping to avoid all that lost time driving to and from Asheville. Remember, Folklore is not a profit-oriented or even a profit-hopeful podcast, but it didn't take long for the state representative for North Carolina House District 116 to remind me why he might find it difficult to fit into my schedule rather than the other way around. U.S. Congressional District 11, in addition to being a bit of a cursed and repeatedly gerrymandered seat, is pretty darn spread out. Polk is on the eastern outskirts, and the western end is a Tennessee line. There are a lot of counties in between here and there crying out for some attention, and we're never going to be near the top of any candidate's priority list. Making things worse this time round is the fact that Rudow and the Republican incumbent he's trying to displace, Chuck Edwards, are asking for votes for only about a third of Polk County, the western and northern portions that cover Saluda and Sunny View. Thanks to our state legislature and Supreme Court, everything else was transferred to NC 14 last year. To be fair, Rudow paid a brief visit to our little corner of District 11 on Coon Dog Day, and I'm sure he'll pop by again before Election Day. But given how little local news coverage there is left these days, this interview might be your best chance to learn why Rudow wants a shot at representing us and the rest of a district that hasn't chosen a Democrat since 2010. We talked in the Democratic Party's Asheville headquarters. Caleb Rudow, welcome to Folklore.
Thanks, James. Good to be here.
I think what we need to do first is for you to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, happy to. You know, I feel very lucky because I had the pleasure of growing up here in western North Carolina. Grew up out in Fairview, went to Asheville City Public Schools. But, you know, my parents taught me that the best thing you can do in life is to be of service, and that's what I spent my life on. So after my undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill, I served in the Peace Corps in Zambia. I did international work in Honduras, Costa Rica, Uganda, all over the world. And then I got a master's in policy at the University of Texas, Austin, hook 'em horns. And I frankly wanted to keep working internationally because that's where my heart was. And that's what my skill set was. I learned a few languages in Africa. I speak Spanish. But then Trump got elected, and I felt like I think our country was better than the meanness and the nastiness and just the awful policy. And so I became a Democratic Party organizer after that. And I've been doing that work as long as with my paid work as a data scientist and a researcher. But the organizing work is what brought me back to North Carolina. And I came back in March of 2020 to work on the election for an organization called Swing Left. And then way leads on to way. I stayed because I was happy to be home, and a state house seat opened up, and I ran for it. And this is a funny bit of small town information. The person who I replaced in the North Carolina House, Susan Fisher, their youngest was in my high school class, and we were in Madrigal's choir together, and we were both voted most likely to change the world for our senior yearbook. So it's a small town, Asheville is. But I served in the North Carolina House for the past 2.5 years. We've been focused on childcare, you know, protecting the French Broad River, housing efforts. We've done a lot of bipartisan work that I'm really proud of, from bipartisan sing-alongs to a bipartisan skydiving jump to happy hours. And I like to tell folks it's working in the North Carolina House is a really funny job because you have to work with your colleagues, but you're also trying to fire them every 2 years in an election, which is a weird balance. But I think, and this is how I feel about politics in general, you want to elect somebody who both is going to fight for you and the things that you elected them to do, but also is going to get along with colleagues and try to find a way forward, because that's why we hire elected officials to work on hard problems and solve them.
So what is it that made you convinced that running for a congressional seat, which is a pretty problematic seat for Democrats, let's face it, we've had a long history of problematic Congress people in this district. You know, you go back to, I think the last one that made its way into Polk County with Heath Schuler. He was problematic from both sides because he was kind of he annoyed Democrats because he wasn't left enough. But he was a blue dog Democrat, so he wasn't really Republican. Mark Meadows, of course, has got enormous legal troubles because of January 6th, and then Madison Cawthorn got drummed out of the party for being too immature.
Being really bad at his job.
and being really bad at his job. And then Chuck Edwards comes along. Now, he doesn't have the immaturity of Madison Cawthorn, but he votes exactly the same way. So it's kind of a history of like, why would you want this job?
People, when I talked to my friends and my family before I decided to run for Congress, and I talked to my therapist, and I was like, is this some kind of problem or some diagnoses? And he was like, you're a glutton for punishment. I can totally see you doing this. But honestly, these are hard jobs. And I'll tell you, when I was in the Peace Corps, the slogan was toughest job you'll ever love. And that's true for a lot of public service jobs. And they're hard because the hours are long and you have to work on challenging problems, and some people can be mad at you for hard decisions you have to make. But I love my state house job, and I honestly love the running for Congress piece of it too. And I'll imagine I'll like the congressional job because they're so impactful, and there are so many problems that people need solved, and they need leadership, and they need somebody to move a way forward. And our world in Western North Carolina has a lot of big challenges. So, I'm not naive to the challenge of this district, but I'll tell you, when I ran, I had a friend from Denmark who was like, oh, you're running in Madison Cawthorn's seat and Mark Meadows' seat, and he knew the seat from Denmark. And it's we like to say the most infamous congressional seat in this country. And that's because we've had leaders over many, many years who have prioritized their own businesses, their own social media likes themselves over the people of Western North Carolina. And Chuck Edwards fits very neatly into that legacy of somebody who, takes $1 million in PPP loans while they fight Medicaid expansion and fight against the child tax credit. Somebody who uses public funds for his own partisan mailers and gets caught for it, and at the same time fights against, people just getting the bare minimum from the government. And this is what's been frustrating, I think, about a lot of our past representation and this is what I'm generally frustrated with the Republican Party and the extremist MAGA portion of it, is that, it's become a party of tax breaks for billionaires and a party that fights against, kids just having enough food to eat and free meals. This is what they attacked Governor Walz on, which was, how dare you have this leftist agenda of making sure kids have enough food to eat? And you're like, come on, we'll fight for that every day. And that's a hill we can die on, because you get into politics to serve people. And you get in because, I talk to neighbors and I talk to folks around Buncombe County, around the district who, the number of grandparents who are taking care of their grandkids because their kids either got addicted to some substance or lost a battle with mental health. And there are real folks struggling here. And we need a leader who's going to think about those people and not just think about what's going to be good for my business and what's going to be good for my own life.
But it is still a relatively red district at the moment. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that, because your predecessor, who ran against Chuck Edwards a couple of years ago, she didn't lose by a whole heck of a lot.
No.
In fact, she did a lot better than I think people thought she would. So how do you approach the task of appealing to a relatively red district in the same way that maybe Tim Walz up in Minnesota, he embodies a lot of the, for lack of a better word, conservative values that maybe Republican voters like to think that they share.
He's a hunter, coach or something.
Yeah, football coach, these sort of things. You, to be blunt, come across as a more worldly, urbane individual, which for a lot of us, especially in Asheville, is a good thing.
Yeah.
But Peace Corps history, speak a few languages, that's probably not what's going to appeal to the folks who are voting for Trump.
It's a great question, and we've thought about this a lot. And I'll tell you, we spend a lot of time outside of Buncombe County. And when we do, we go out and talk to voters. And I don't introduce myself as a Democrat first. I go up to people and I say, hey, what's on your mind? What are you worried about? And, especially outside of Buncombe, folks are pretty upset that their teachers don't get paid enough and their public schools aren't funded, because public schools are some of the biggest employers in those areas. They're pretty upset that, their rural hospital closed down because they didn't expand Medicaid, and there's no access to health care. And so, I think if you focus not on, frankly, the identity politics or the culture wars, and you focus on what actually people care about, the Democratic Party agenda is one that I think is really popular in Western North Carolina. And I think when you look at the politicians that have been the Republican Party and the MAGA Republican Party has put up, they're the most extreme, least qualified for pretty much every position. And I think our opportunity this year as Democrats is to go out there and tell folks what the Democratic Party stands for. And this is what, the Biden administration has done to bring back American manufacturing, to invest in clean energy, to work on raising the minimum wage. This is a really popular policy platform. I think the thing that's left for us is to go out there and talk to folks.
Well, what are you doing on that front? I mean, one of the problems in Polk County is now we only have half a congressman kind of thing, looking forward to.
Right.
And I haven't seen almost anybody pay a visit to my town, Saluda, or Columbus or Tryon. There hasn't been a lot of visits yet. Is that simply your campaign really hasn't got up to full throttle yet?
One, we have a third of Polk County, and it's kind of like the carve out for Saluda. So, we were at the Coon Dog Day. I ran the 5K there. We had a canvas there a few weeks ago. So I think we've been in Polk County 3 times already. So, the big goal, and I'll tell you this, is, we need to win Buncombe by more and lose everywhere else by less. And if we can do that, then we win. And that means we got to show up everywhere. And there's 16 counties in the district. It's about the size of Connecticut. So, we try to be everywhere, but we can't be everywhere all at once. But, most weekends we're in 5 to 6 counties a weekend. So I'll tell you about our last Saturday. I got up at 6 o'clock and I ran a 5K in Asheville. And then we drove to Jackson County for the launch of the Harris Walls campaign. And then we had an event in Oakley for the Democratic Party. Then we had a Transylvania County event. And then we had a canvassing event in Black Mountain. And then we did Shindig on the Green. And that's just a normal Saturday for us. So we show up everywhere. I think the way to win it is just being out there in the community and being with folks.
Well, I have to admit that even though we haven't seen a lot of candidates so far this election cycle, we haven't seen too much of our elected representatives either. I mean, this is, Chuck Edwards' low visibility in this part of the county this part of the district is well known.
Chuck likes to talk a lot about the van that drives around that does his work, but he's never in the van. He never actually shows up to talk to people. And, I'll tell you, we've been hoping that we'll have a debate because I think that people deserve to see a debate. And I think that's part of our democratic process. And Chuck Edwards recently said, I'm too busy with my duties as a congressperson. You're like, we haven't seen him anywhere either. And also, heck, if the vice president has time for a debate, Chuck Edwards has time for a debate. And so I think he is always, I just don't think he's a man of the people and a person who really wants to be out there talking to folks. And I think, that's really the job of being an elected official is to be with people and talk and show up. Because, as you noted, people know when their representatives aren't there and they notice. And it gives them a feeling of, not having representation and not having leadership. And that's the job.
Well, what I'd like to see, and this is just me speaking, but I have seen Congress people who they exemplify something I don't see anymore. And it's going back to the 80s and 90s when I was a reporter. There was one guy, his name was Jerry Studs. He was a congressman in Massachusetts. And his deal was every 3 months he would show up in your part of his district and hold a town hall where he would just answer questions. And this was a regular thing. It was so regular it wasn't even newsworthy, right? And now, if a congressman holds a town hall in their district, people go, wow, I haven't seen that before, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what I'm looking for from people like you is, can you give us a commitment that you'll try to embrace? I don't know if it's possible anymore in this day where Congress people are spending hours every single day of the year on the phone trying to raise money. But is it possible we could go back to the times when a congressman would actually come to the district and listen to the people?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the elected officials have hard schedules, but when folks say they don't have time to be with their constituents or listen, it means they don't understand their job. And that is the job. It's to listen, to be with the people. And, I'll tell you what I've done in the State House. One, I think, town halls are great. Honestly, the challenge with town halls is that only the people who are most interested in politics show up. And so when we host a town hall, it's often the people we've already seen at other events. And so for me, the thing that we try to do is go to the places where people maybe aren't as cued into politics. And that means going to events, showing up at people's doorstep. We do nonpartisan canvassing in the State House, which means I just knock on everybody's door in the neighborhood and I say, hey, I'm Caleb, I represent you in Raleigh. What's on your mind? And I do that because if you only talk to the people who show up at town halls and you only talk to people who are most engaged, you're hearing from citizens who are frankly not representative often of the total grouping of people in your district. Because most people, you know, frankly, are just trying to make ends meet and, you know, cook food for their kids and deal with everything they have to. And I think our system right now is geared much more towards the, you know, the folks who are paying attention and show up everything, and that's great, and we appreciate all those people. But I think a part of the problem with some of our policy outcomes are because we only talk to the people who are most checked in, and we represent everybody, not just those folks. And so I've really tried to make an effort in the North Carolina House and I think through this congressional race too, to talk to the people who are, you know, not just the folks who show up. Because frankly, one of the big challenges in running for Congress in general is that unless you're very strategic about where you show up, you'll see the same people over and over again.
So what you're talking about is trying to be active at seeking out people's opinions rather than just waiting for them to come to you.
Right. Yeah, because, you know, I think this is true for a lot of issues we have. If you only wait for the people that come to you, your opinions are going to be biased towards wealthier people, people with more time on their hands, people who are more cued in, you know, probably people with a higher education level. And, you know, I think there's that's just often not representative of the district as a whole. And we got to listen to everybody. And so I think unless you're really going out there and trying to find people who are not checked in, you're just not going to understand the whole value of the district, or all the values of the district.
But you can't put too much emphasis on communications, right? I mean, Madison Cawthorn famously said, forget about policy, I'm just going to do communications. It didn't work out really well for him.
No, and I would say, you know, I don't know if I would call what we're doing like exactly communications, because I think for Madison Cawthorn, the whole goal for him was not to listen to people, it was to raise his social media likes. And it was to be a social and a culture warrior, and to be somebody who, when he got done, he could be an influencer. And I think when you're talking about actually just going out and talking to people, it's more of trying to understand what people actually care about and what's on their minds. You know, the challenge of being in office, and this is for my state house district, you know, I have to represent 90,000 people. What do those people believe in? What do they want? What do they care about? What are they worried about? And the reason you do this kind of outreach, it is communications. A part of it is at least understanding the people. Make sure people understand their representative, but a big part of it is just understanding what's going on in the district. And the big problem with Chuck not showing up in Polk County or elected officials not showing up is that it's really hard to understand unless you show up.
Well, that is my next question. I want to talk about what you think the priorities of the district are. You say, you know, you represent 90,000 people now as a state rep.
Yeah.
You'll be representing 400,000, I think, if you win Congress.
It's going to be more like, I think 800 is the way that they do the district. It's,
well,
yeah, a lot of people, way more people. Yeah.
So how do you find out, or you must have already have an idea of what are the priorities of Western North Carolina and people like in Polk County, which, because we're so small, we're often overlooked. Yeah. We don't have a lot of industry. We don't have a lot of anything of one thing in particular, maybe farming.
Yeah.
So what do you think our priorities are? In other words, what will you focus on if you win this seat?
Right. You know, number one, I think, you know, we talk about protecting the environment in Western North Carolina because it's the right thing to do, because it protects our economy, which is based on tourism. And it's also an issue that I think a lot of folks agree on. And then we talk about typically the 3 H's of the campaign, which are healthcare, housing, and human rights. And I think we talk about healthcare first. You know, look, across Western North Carolina, you've got counties that don't have places where you can deliver a baby. They don't have a hospital anymore, that, you know, don't have healthcare access. And we've made some progress with Medicaid expansion. But, you know, what we see in Asheville and we see across the district is corporate healthcare taking over hospitals and not delivering on results. And that's been an issue not just in Buncombe, but across the NC11 district. And so there's a real place for a North Carolina State House rep, a U.S. congressional rep to be a voice for that. And I think what you heard from Chuck Edwards was he blamed the sale of HCA on the failures of Obamacare, was his thing, which is always blaming. But I think, you know, look, the job of a state house rep is to stand up for their people. And number one, you know, one of the things that a congressional rep can do is create new laws about it. And I think a lot of the stuff that the Harris Walls campaign has done around prescription drug price gouging, a lot of the work around the Center Care for Medicaid studies is around making sure hospitals live up to their end of the deal. And I think we haven't had a congressional rep who's really stood behind the people, and they've mostly stood behind, you know, corporate medicine. So there's a bunch of healthcare issues across. You can talk about expanding Medicare. We have an aging population. Dental and vision are not covered. But healthcare being one of the biggest expenses people have to pay for, also for an aging district, also for a rural district, is a really important issue across the area. Number two, housing. We live in a place that's amazing and beautiful, but it's also a vacation place where, I don't want Western North Carolina to just be a place of people with second homes and a place where people who can't afford to buy a first home. And one of the big challenges we have in Asheville is that our folks who work in the service industry, our law enforcement officers, have to live in different counties. And this is true for Hendersonville too. We've got places across Western North Carolina that are beautiful, but affordable housing has been a huge problem in workforce housing. So there's a big role for the federal government there. I think Kamala Harris's tax credit for $25,000 for first home buyers is a big start. But I think we also need to build more housing supply for folks. And we need to make sure that folks who are, buying a second or third home or vacation home are paying into the system so that people can afford to buy one home. And then the last thing we talk about is human rights. And I love seeing the DNC convention and all the talk about freedom, because I really do believe the Democratic Party has a great claim on that word and a great claim on patriotism. And I think, you can't call yourself the party of rights as Republicans do when you're trying to put Chuck Edwards in your doctor's office with you to make your decisions about when and how to start a family. And it's about the right to marry the person you want to. It's about, the right to read the books that you want to. We've seen attacks on libraries across the NC 11 Congressional District for, a pride display occasionally, or, something that is, frankly, a freedom of speech issue. So, those are our big priorities on the campaign trail, and that's what we're focused on.
All right, well, let's pick up on one of those issues because it's my favorite little thing to talk about, and that's protecting the environment. I think everybody in the district wants to keep this place as beautiful as it is from a natural point of view. But we have to also embrace our responsibility in a global sense to shepherd this transition away from fossil fuel economy to electricity-based economy. And it's not easy in Western North Carolina. Mountains aren't the easiest place to put solar arrays. Yeah. And putting wind turbines on the top of mountain ridges isn't a very popular thing to do, although I think inevitably probably going to happen. How do we work with our congresspeople to play a role in that shift?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think there's a bunch of reasons we want to focus on this shift. One of the things we worked on was electric car chargers in Western North Carolina, because we're a tourist economy, and it's not just about what we can do that's right for the planet. It's people are going to come visit here and they need a place to charge their cars. And I'll tell you, in Chuck Edwards' debate with Christian Reagan, they basically both said climate change doesn't exist, and we don't need electric cars, we don't need to change. It's all drill, baby, drill. So I think the biggest challenge, and I think the difference between the Democratic Party now and the Republican Party, is the Democratic Party is looking forward and trying to find ways we solve problems and we continue to lead in the world. And clean energy is going to be one of those global economies and ways that America stays competitive. And we had a problem with the solar industry. America invented all the technology, and then China now builds all the solar panels. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden administration bringing back American manufacturing and incentivizing battery production, incentivizing production of some of these industries, which are really important for American competition and really important for solving climate change and bringing those back to the United States. So I think Western North Carolina does have a unique challenge. And some of these counties too are 50% national forest. And so, when you're talking about building some of this energy, it could be a challenge. I think, when we think about solving this problem, we have to think about how does the state work together and how do we share resources? How do we build a smart grid so we can transfer power from different places? I think we should have a system in which, and there's, offshore wind farms that are trying to put in Eastern North Carolina that are exciting. And if you look at, some of the, the governor's plan to cut consumption by 2050 or to get net zero by 2050. There are lots of ideas about that, but that has to mean we work together as a state to solve that problem and transferring power from distribution sites and other places. I also think solving this has to involve some nuclear power, because we've got, the big challenge with wind and solar is battery. And how do you have energy? One, energy where it's close to where you use it, but two, how do you store up that energy so that when the sun isn't shining, you still have energy. And there are some really interesting solutions on that lines, pumping water up into big lakes and pushing it back down, or they have these really cool new technology about just lifting weights up and then it goes back down over time. So,
yeah, abandoned mines are excellent places for that sort of thing, actually.
But like all that requires, us to have a forward-looking vision about it. And so I think to the last part of your question, which is, how do you talk to representatives about this? I think we have to have representatives who, one, see it as a problem, because I think the Republican Party's push for drill baby drill is just not going to get us out of this, and it's not going to solve our energy price problems, and it's not going to allow us to stay competitive. So I think, number one, we have to get some acknowledgement from folks that this is the problem, and we want our elected officials to actually work towards it.
But it seems to me that a lot of this conversation ends up in the same place. Western North Carolina, because of its natural forests and because of its topography, isn't an ideal place for a lot of renewable energy. I mean, we can have small things like stored hydropower, maybe even some geothermal here and there. Well, those are micro-sized projects. So what we're really talking about is building more interconnected grid to nuclear reactors in Southern North Carolina. And as you may recall, a few years ago, Duke Energy tried to build a new power line to do exactly that, to bring power from the east to the west. And people here were not happy. Now, in my opinion, that was just a mistake from Duke because they wanted to build conventional, 180-foot tall towers rather than low-profile ones. But it's a very tricky subject because people don't like the idea of more power lines. Yeah. And I think it's inevitable that America is going to have to embrace more power lines. But how do we convince people that that's the sacrifice we have to make?
So I think this is a critical problem for all climate change problems, where you'll have folks, and I have friends like this who are like, climate change is the biggest problem in the world, and then they fly wherever they want on every vacation, and they don't make their personal choices. And I think this is true for a lot of problems in our world, in which we, complain about poverty, but we don't make any decisions to actually donate or do things differently. Or we complain about the tax system, but when we get, when folks I know who have plenty of money get a little bit extra tax, they get upset. And so,
or another classic example would be, I'm all in favor of affordable housing, just not across the street from me.
Totally. And so, I think, and this is true for, all of the places where they want to put lithium mines, and you're like, we need more batteries. And you're like, oh, we have to, we don't want them here, we want them somewhere else. And you're like, look, I want to be sensitive to communities that are facing the brunt of this. And when we build new things, we want to build them in as smart a way as possible to limit some of that. But, I think we used to live in a country in which people were willing to make sacrifices. You think about Victory Gardens and all these other things that were like, we're solving a problem that is incredibly large and hard. And it's going to require folks to think a little bit differently about how they make decisions. And that may not be the most popular political slogan, but I do think if we're going to solve some of our country's really big problems, we have to get folks to make some sacrifices. And we have to find ways that we're all a part of that solution.
Well, you could put that on a poster. We are all part of the solution.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think people should think about when they decide, whom to vote for this November?
I think what we've continued to see from every past elected representative in Congress who has been for the NC11 Congressional District, it's been about dividing folks. And it's been about, what Chuck Edwards does is constantly bash Asheville or bash Buncombe County and against everybody else. And I think, when I talk to folks, when I do this door-to-door canvassing, most people are just tired of the toxic politics, and they're tired of politicians spending more time dividing us than trying to figure out what are the things we can work on together. And I think that is the critical problem for politics in Western North Carolina, our country, and I think folks are just ready to move forward.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you squeezing me into your schedule.
Thanks, James. It was a pleasure.
One more thing before I wrap this up. If you're not sure which congressional district you live in, and therefore whether this entire episode is worth your time, if you live in the White Oak area in particular, then you'll want to figure that out before you cast a ballot. Early voting at the Polk County Board of Elections office on Ward Street in Columbus begins today, October 17th. There's been a bunch of changes to the way votes are processed for those of us affected by Tropical Storm Helene. Check out the notes for this episode on your podcasting app for links. Send your feedback, suggestions for guests and topics, because I will get back to non-election subjects in November. To jamesh@polklore.com, and thanks for listening.